Lately, I've been seeing this question pop up in psychedelic media, in the scientific community. Apparently, some people in psychiatric and other medical circles have been asking a very strange question about psychedelics. They've been asking, is psychedelic drug approval being driven by science or is it being driven by politics? This is a totally bizarre question, and it betrays an absolute lack of historical knowledge about what we're doing, how we got here, what's really going on in the field of psychedelics. So, psychedelic approval, psychedelic policy changes are being driven by science, unequivocally. Psychedelic prohibition was driven by politics, and the fact that anybody thinks it could ever be the other way around means that we need to go back and have a history lesson. I'm Clay. I'm a licensed therapist and Colorado's first licensed natural medicine clinical facilitator. I run a practice where I do therapy, psilocybin-assisted therapy, ketamine-assisted therapy, and I've been involved in the field of psychedelics for some time now, about 10 years. In this video, I want to take the question, is this fueled by science or politics, and trace it back a ways, trace it back through actual history. The really simple answer is that psychedelics have always had really good science behind them, and politics has been really bad. So the science has been pretty good, and the politics has been pretty bad. Politics are, in fact, the only reason that psychedelics are controversial in the first place. So let's start before Prohibition. In the 1950s and the 1960s, psychedelics were not fringe by any means. This wasn't some outsider thing. They were really mainstream psychiatry, mainstream psychology. After Albert Hofmann synthesized LSD in 1943 for the first time, the pharmaceutical company that he worked for, Sandoz, began distributing LSD to researchers around the world for free. And they explicitly recommended it even in the 1940s as an aid to psychotherapy. Over about 15 years, thousands of people were treated with psychedelic psychotherapy. And this is documented in peer-reviewed literature from that time. Going all the way back to middle of the century reviews, we can see that psychedelics had a place in science. And it's a period of psychedelic research that we call pre-prohibition. Science wasn't done in the same way back then that it is today, and so a lot of those studies don't hold up to modern day scrutiny, but they were still doing research. There was still evidence of the day showing that psychedelics had efficacy. That's going to become important. By 1965, there were 3 fully fleshed out clinical models for how to work with psychedelics. There was psycholytic therapy, which was repeated low to moderate doses, where you kind of keep a foot in the normal world and you use the psychedelic to consciously go through the content of your mind. There was high-dose psychedelic chemotherapy, as they called it. And then there was what they called psychedelic peak therapy that focused on transformative experiences. So there was chemical therapy, more pure treatment. There was psychedelic peak therapy, and there was psycholytic therapy. They were, even in the 1960s, fleshing out all these models for how to productively, scientifically, work with psychedelics. There was a meta-analysis that was published in 2016 that looked at 19 studies on psychedelics for mood disorders that happened between 1949 and 1973. Right? So between 1949 and 1973, psychedelic research was active. And the results of these studies showed that 79% of the 423 patients who had undergone psychedelic treatments in that time period showed clinically significant improvements after treatment. And again, the methodologies of those times are not up to par with the methodologies of today, but that's meaningful. Almost 80% of the 423 patients were thought to be meaningfully improved by psychedelics in the studies from 1949 to 1973. So for reference, psychiatry in the 1950s was still driving ice picks in people's brains. They were still doing orbital frontal lobotomies. That's where psychiatry was in the 1950s. And even then, we knew that psychedelics were useful, clinically, scientifically. So psychedelics in this pre-prohibition era, prior to the Controlled Substances Act of 1970, prior to criminalization, really clearly, really obviously, had a super robust clinical base to them, a clinical foundation. So what exactly happened? Well, what happened was the 1960s. LSD got out of the laboratory. It got tangled up with counterculture. I think a lot of us know the story of Timothy Leary, the Vietnam War protests, the hippies, civil rights. LSD became associated, psychedelics became associated with everything that the establishment of American culture was afraid of and against. And there was an overwhelming political backlash. In 1970, the Controlled Substances Act placed LSD, psilocybin, and mescaline and DMT into Schedule 1. This was the most restrictive category for any drug that's defined as having no accepted medical use and a high potential for abuse, right? That's no accepted medical use even under supervision. That claims no accepted medical use under any context. And what's terrible about this is that even in the 1970s, we had research showing that all of these substances, every one of the substances that I just named, had medical use. And the DEA placement on the scheduling list wasn't based on data. Even in 1970, it wasn't based on science. Even then, it was a political decision made in the middle of a culture war. So even here, we can see that the decision to criminalize psychedelics in the first place was based on pure politics. It was the decision to criminalize that's based on politics, not the decision to reform, to change, to give access. If I haven't driven home the point enough, I want to bring the John Ehrlichman quote back, because this is just the most damning piece of evidence that we have. Ehrlichman was a policy advisor to the Nixon administration, and he said basically verbatim, the Nixon administration had two enemies, the anti-war left and black people. They knew they couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black, but they could associate the anti-war left with marijuana and psychedelics and black communities with heroin, and then criminalize both of those things heavily so that they could disrupt the communities. If you haven't seen this quote, maybe you're new to psychedelics, maybe you're new here, but it's all over the place. It's everywhere, and it's damning. And I'm quoting Ehrlichman when I say, did I know? Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. So they knew. They knew they were lying. They passed the policy anyway. And this is sort of how government agencies have tended to operate around these substances. And that's the founding logic of the war on drugs. That's the founding logic of the predicament of prohibition that got us here in the first place. It's always been about social control, and it's always been about ignoring science. And the cleanest example, the most purely terrible example of this is actually from MDMA. So the story of MDMA goes a little bit like this, in case you haven't heard it. By the early 1980s, MDMA was being used by psychiatrists and therapists across the United States as an adjunct to psychotherapy. Clinical practitioners of all kinds, psychiatrists, psychologists, therapists of different colors, reported hundreds of cases, particularly with trauma, with couples work, with end-of-life distress, where MDMA was really useful. MDMA wasn't FDA approved, but it also wasn't Schedule 1, so it was in that kind of gray area in the 1980s. People knew that it was helpful. Everybody working with it knew that it helped for a lot of the kinds of issues that brought people to therapy in the first place. So when in July of 1984, the DEA announced its intention to place MDMA in Schedule 1, things started to kind of catalyze for the modern psychedelic revival. This is the moment, the DEA's announcement of their intention to criminalize MDMA, that actually planted the seed for the modern psychedelic medicine movement. There was a young researcher named Rick Doblin. You might recognize him as the founder of MAPS. He led a group of psychiatrists and psychotherapists to push back against the DEA. This included people like Harvard psychiatrist Lester Grinspoon, psychiatrist George Greer. These are people who had personally facilitated MDMA sessions and had documented the outcome. This group, led by Doblin, requested formal administrative hearings, which they had a total legal right to do, and the DEA agreed. The hearings for MDMA in the 1980s began in 1985, before a DEA administrative law judge that they appointed. The judge's name was Francis Young, right? So this is really important. This wasn't an outside court. This wasn't some fringe thing. This Francis Young was a DEA judge, and it was a DEA internal process that Doblin and his team went through. There were 3 rounds of hearings in 1985. There was expert testimony from psychiatrists, psychologists, pharmacologists, researchers, therapists, all kinds of people that really profoundly, really solidly documented the clinical case for MDMA. But before the judge could even finish, before these hearings even concluded, the DEA just decided unilaterally to make a decision. And on May 28th, 1985, in the middle of these hearings, the DEA emergency scheduled MDMA. said this is a public health crisis and we need to make this the most restrictive category possible. We need to make it so nobody can ever have MDMA. They cited concerns about potential neurotoxicity, and they claimed a lack of established medical use. At the same time that a whole group of medical professionals were actively testifying in court that MDMA had medical use, they just ignored it. It was the first time that the DEA had ever used emergency scheduling powers, and it later turned out they didn't even actually have the legal authority to do it. The Attorney General at the time hadn't formally delegated those powers to the DEA yet. So several people who were arrested for MDMA later had their cases dismissed because of this, because the DEA jumped the gun on scheduling. But the hearings with Doblin and his crew continued anyway, and in May of 1986, after reviewing the evidence, Judge Francis Young, who you'll remember is a DEA judge, issued his ruling. And this is basically what he said. I want you to remember that this is from 1986. A DEA law judge in 1986 basically said that the evidence does not establish MDMA has a high potential for abuse. And it can't be placed in Schedule 1 because it does have a currently accepted medical use in treatment, and it does have accepted safety for use under medical supervision. That's what a DEA judge said in 1986. Judge Young also explicitly rejected the DEA's claim that the FDA approval was required to establish accepted medical use. He said that doctors using MDMA in therapy was, in fact, evidence of medical use, which seems kind of obvious. And his recommendation was to put MDMA into Schedule 3, which would have continued to allow it to be used for therapeutic purposes since the 1980s. Imagine how many people could have been helped by MDMA if it would have been allowed to be accessible. Imagine what the collective burden of trauma would look like in our culture if we would have had access to MDMA since the 1980s. The DEA didn't care about any of that. The DEA didn't care about Francis Young's opinion or the opinion of the professionals. Their response in the 1980s was to attack their own judge. Totally reasonable and sane, right? So the DEA lawyers filed a motion against their own judge, and Judge Young was accused of being biased, accused of failing to reference the evidence. After this, Doblin and his crew pushed back really hard against these claims, and ultimately the DEA administrators that were attacking Judge Young themselves ultimately had to agree that the allegations of bias were improper, and they removed the allegation of bias from the record, but they overruled him anyway. They admitted that they were sort of manufacturing a false claim about his bias, but they didn't really care. They continued on with their rabid decision and desire to place MDMA in Schedule 1, regardless of the evidence. And in October of 1986, DEA Administrator John Lawn placed MDMA in Schedule 1. John Lawn. And his stated rationale was, if you can believe it, that MDMA isn't FDA approved. And so because it's not FDA approved, it must have no accepted medical use and therefore should be placed in Schedule 1. What? Let's go over that again a little bit slower because it's a strange, nonsensical argument. What they said is that you can't get FDA approval for a Schedule 1 substance because Schedule 1 means it has no accepted medical use. And you can't establish medical use through research because Schedule 1 makes research impossible. It's this weird logic loop that's designed to never resolve. So, following that, Doblin and his crew appealed. And in 1987, another federal appeals court ruled in their favor. So, 2 years after the initial suit against the FDA, MAPS and the MAPS crew appealed again, and another judge called the DEA's reasoning unpersuasive. The appeal in 1987 found that the DEA's definition of accepted medical use was too narrow, and it was contradicted by the original intent of Congress. And that court in 1987 voided MDMA's Schedule 1 status and recommended that MDMA be put in Schedule 3. But the DEA is really persistent with their nonsense, and a month later, John Law at the DEA put it right back into Schedule 1. And this time, he dismissed the testimony of a psychiatrist who had documented over 200 cases of MDMA therapy. And he said that his reason was those cases hadn't been published in medical journals. Think about what that means. It means that clinicians documenting clinical work in real time doesn't mean anything. And so MDMA was put back in Schedule 1, and it stayed there for the next 36 years. Still, today, it's Schedule 1. So when people ask if modern-day psychedelic approvals are based on science or policy, it's a little bit maddening. It's a little bit like, what are you even talking about? Why would you ask such a thing? It's a little bit like asking, is the move from the geocentric model, where the Earth is the center of the solar system, to the heliocentric model, where we recognize that the sun is at the center, is that based on science? Or is that based on politics? Because I really think that maybe there's some suspicious politics to what's happening here. Weird. So for MDMA, if you want to know whether it's based on science or politics, here's your answer. Here's what happened. The DEA held hearings. They hired a judge. They heard evidence. They were told by their own judge that MDMA should not be Schedule 1. They were told the same thing again by a federal appeals court, and they went ahead and they scheduled MDMA anyway. They put it in Schedule 1, regardless of all this evidence. So that's not science. Clearly, that's politics ignoring science. It's not that psychedelic approvals and psychedelic policy change is based on politics. It's that psychedelic prohibition was based on politics, and psychedelic approvals are based clearly on science. When the DEA did what they did, that was the government agency deciding it wanted to ignore science and reverse engineer a justification for what they wanted all along. And if we fast forward to today, the psychedelic renaissance, we're in a cultural moment, the psychedelic renaissance. What we know as the psychedelic renaissance is the cumulative effort of decades. It's a body of peer-reviewed research that began in the 1950s that, yes, was paused by the war on drugs in the 1970s, but has been quietly rebuilding since the early 1990s, when researchers all around the world, Germany, Switzerland, the US, began to get some permission to do psychedelic work. We have now too many endeavors to even count, to even name, that are focused on psychedelics. Legitimate scientific endeavors: Johns Hopkins, NYU, the Imperial College of London, University of California, San Francisco, MAPS, Compass Pathways, USONA, all of these studies, the University of Colorado, right? All of these studies for psilocybin on treatment-resistant depression, end-of-life anxiety, alcohol use disorder, tobacco cessation, PTSD, right? All of these things, all of these studies, and they keep coming. Hundreds and hundreds of peer-reviewed studies over the last decade. It's not soft data. It's not anecdotal. It's all been through institutional review boards, FDA scrutiny, and peer review through major journals. So really clearly, this is science driving policy. The psychedelic revival is science driving policy. It's not politics or even cultural pressure. It's been a long and challenging scientific slog to get to the place where psychedelics are even an acceptable form of conversation, an acceptable thing to study. And the only thing that's gotten us here is science. So let me bring this back to the original question. Are psychedelic approvals being fueled by science or politics? The answer is science. Unequivocally, inarguably. The reason the question even gets asked in this skeptical, leading way is because the prohibition that came before it was politics dressed up to look like science. For 50 plus years, we've had federal drug policy and federal drug policy education that was telling the public that these substances had no medical value. And a lot of medical practitioners are still fairly skeptical about it. We had generations of Americans who grew up with really powerful propaganda telling us that psychedelics were dangerous. So when medical evidence shows up in clinical trials, I think maybe it can sound like a story that's being constructed rather than maybe what it actually is, which is the truth finally getting out after being suppressed for decades and decades and decades. So is politics completely absent from the landscape? No, of course not, unfortunately. Think about this. For 40 years, researchers, clinicians, psychiatrists, psychologists, patient advocates built a scientific case for psychedelic medicine. There were peer-reviewed studies, phase 3 trials, veterans testified before Congress, a DEA administrative law judge ruling that MDMA should be Schedule 3, another federal judge making the same ruling, and policy didn't budge. Nothing happened. There was no change. Then, in April of 2026, Joe Rogan texted Donald Trump about Ibogaine And within a couple of days, the president was signing an executive order directing the FDA to fast track psychedelic research. That's politics. I want to be clear. I think the executive order is on balance, all in all, a good thing. More research access is good. Veterans getting treatment is good. But let's sit with the mechanism of that for just a second. 4 decades of rigorous science couldn't move federal policy, but a text from a podcaster did. That tells us something about how policy actually gets made in this country, and it's pretty ugly. It's not flattering. It's not science, right? That's celebrity access and timing and all kinds of weird things that are going on there. So yeah, politics have a role to play in psychedelics, but the evidence base is really there. Here's a part that I want you to consider deeply. The same circular nonsensical logic from 1986 is still in place. No medical use because no FDA approval. No FDA approval because Schedule 1. The institutions that we're relying on to give us access to these things are the same institutions that have been apparently irreparably broken and or incapable of applying basic logic since at least the 1970s. That's what we're relying on. There's some problems there. So when you hear somebody framing the current psychedelic landscape, the current psychedelic revival, as some kind of political project, you got to ask yourself, which side of the political project are they defending? Which part of it is politics? Because the status quo, this like pro-drug war ethos, this fear around psychedelics, this Schedule 1 restricted research, no clinical access, even to some degree the medicalization that's super paranoid about what these things are and what they do, that's the political position. The political position is and has always been to restrict, to be fearful, to be skeptical, and to ignore evidence, both scientific and cultural evidence, right? That's the position that's been built on suppressed science, on ignored research, on judges that have been overruled. And psychedelic reform, psychedelic access, that's the evidence-based position. The science was there in 1986, and it's there now. What changed isn't the data. What changed is who finally got listened to. Okay, that's what we got for today. If this is useful or interesting for you at all, please subscribe. I do what I can to put out videos like this as frequently as I can while also running a full-time psychedelic therapy practice all on my own. I make videos on science, on therapy itself, on the history that most people don't really know about. If you're working in this space, if you're considering a journey for yourself, or if you're just trying to understand what's happening in this bizarre field of psychedelics, I'd rather you get the information from someone who's actually doing the work. Okay, thank you so much. I'll see you next time.